Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell. Well, I got a request to do a video about the structure of dialectic for those of you who want to try it on your own at home. So for this video, what I'm going to do is draw from Proclus, who gave us, I think, the most detailed structure of how to do dialectic. And I'll be pulling then from his commentary on Plato's Parmenides, and this comes from Book 5. So he tells us that we want to start by choosing a topic. Basically, you want to ask yourself what it is that you want to do a dialectic exploration on. So you may choose, for example, providence or beauty or logos or justice. Whatever you choose, it's a thing in itself that you're choosing. You're thinking about not just beauty in our physical world, but beauty itself. If it exists, then what follows from that? Or logos, if there really is logos in the universe, what follows from that? And so whatever you choose, I'll just call it X. You basically are asking yourself, if it exists, then what follows? Now, I'm going to add a few words to this question. If it exists and is functioning, because what you ultimately want to do is go beyond just logic of saying, well, if this exists, then what would follow based on what you've read, based on logic. You want to really get a feel for it. The thing about dialectic is you come back to it again and again. It's not a one-time thing. It helps us to advance our thinking and also to kind of see how we are growing as we continue along. Thinking of like the cave allegory, we're going up that steep ascent of understanding, and ultimately we want to go out into the upper world and see the things in themselves as they truly are. And as we get a better feel for them, as we do start to explore the upper world, we start to have a more intuitive sense of how the universe is functioning because these absolute realities truly are. And so that's where we're going with it. Okay, so there are 4 basic questions that we want to consider. And again, I'll just call it X for now because you can plug it in with whatever your exploration is. So what follows for that absolute reality in relation to itself? What follows for that absolute reality in relation to others? What follows for others in relation to themselves? And so others is usually whatever participates in that absolute reality. So what follows for that absolute reality in relation to our realm, for example, that participates in it? How do we interact with one another because this absolute reality exists? And then the final question is, what follows for the others, us, for example, in relation to that absolute reality? So the first question, what we're really getting at here, is we're looking at what it is. And the middle 2 questions I see as asking how that absolute reality functions. And the final question, by returning from our realm up to the absolute realities, we're looking for implications. Okay, with that in mind, I'm going to plug in Providence, and I'm going to use Proclus's example in the text as our example. So we're going to look at it in full. But first, we're going to break each of those 4 questions. Let me go back to them for a moment. We're going to take each of these 4 questions and break these down into 3 parts. And so we're going to have 12 questions total. Ultimately, we're going to end up with 24 questions, but we're going to take it in pieces because it's quite a bit to take in all at once. So we'll start with the first 12. And what we do is we're going to take these 4, and then we're going to break each one into 3 parts. We're going to ask what is true of it, what is not true, and what is in a way true and in a way not true. Okay, so we take this basic question, what follows if providence exists? And again, I'm going to take Proclus's example. I will quote it for you in full. It comes from the translation by Morrow and Dillon. For those of you who have the text, here are the page numbers. If you don't have the text, it is a little bit of a pricey book, but you can probably find it at your local library. And certainly those of you who are university students, I imagine you have it at your university's library. It is a book to think about buying if you don't have it now. There is quite a bit in it that's useful, and it's definitely a book worth studying. But I'm going to give you the whole of this sample dialectic so that you have it You can maybe download this video or take some screenshots, but it is definitely one that is worth studying. I'm going to just run through the whole thing for you here, but it's one that you want to really contemplate. It's really a rich source for contemplations, not just going through it once. It's not really enough to really get the full feel of it. That said, let's jump in. Okay, so what follows for providence in relation to itself? Well, what is true of it is being of the nature of the good. Since providence obviously is that goodness that flows through all, it must be of the nature of the good. Because it flows through all, it must be infinite in power and have effective capability. What is not true? Being turned aside from its purpose or being bereft of will. And partly true, partly not true, being one and not one. Just as the gods collectively are a unity, yet there are many gods, we can say the same of providence. There's a sense in which it is a one, a sense in which it proliferates. What follows for providence in relation to those things that participate in providence? Well, in relation to other things, there will be true of it ruling over them, preserving each one of them, the goodness that preserves and keeps it whole, containing the beginnings and the ends of all things, and bringing everything perfectly to its conclusion. That idea of a conclusion is one that's worth coming back to think about what that means. Not true of it, being injurious to the things it watches over, producing the unexpected or being the cause of disorder. And then partly true, partly not true, the idea of being present to all, immanent, and being transcendent. So if it's both, then there's a sense in which each is true and each is not true. Okay, what follows for others in relation to themselves? How do we interact with one another? Because providence exists and providence is functioning. Well, not suffering anything at each other's hands randomly, suffering no injustice from any quarter. Now, initially the knee-jerk reaction might be, that's not true. And so this is one to hold on to. This forces you to question if providence really is a thing. And so it's one you have to keep coming back to. Because if it is correct that providence exists, then there must be a way in which this is correct. And maybe you're just not seeing it yet. But if it's truly wrong, then that would imply that maybe providence doesn't exist or that this answer is wrong. And so it's one to keep coming back to. What is not true is that there's some element of chance in our existence and also our being unrelated to each other. Again, you have to question, is that right or wrong? What is in a way true and in a way not true? That we're all good. And this I think we can all see, the idea of having a Buddha nature, for example. Yet clearly we're each a work in progress. And so there's a way in which it's true that our essence is good, that we're all good in essence, and yet there's also a sense in which it's not true. That we're good, what follows for others in relation to providence? So now we're looking at those implications of what follows for us in relation to providence in itself. In relation to it, there is true being dependent upon it, and in every way being guarded and benefited by it. Not true that we oppose it or that we can ever escape it, because if it's functioning, it's a divine law. We can't escape it even if we want to, any more than we could escape gravity, for example. Okay, true and not true is that each thing partakes of providence, for in a way, each takes a share of it, but in a way, it is not it that it takes a share of, but rather the good things that are proportioned from it to each thing. Okay, so that is our first 12 questions of what follows if providence exists. But Proclus says that this is not enough. And already we can see that it's not enough because we had some questions about those first 12. Not sure if his answers were all correct. A way to take it even further and to consider it more deeply is to ask, what follows if providence doesn't exist? Well, now initially in our own practices with dialectic, we're probably going to find ourselves just taking the opposite of those first 12 answers. And initially, maybe that's fine, and that still does give us something to contemplate of what would follow if the opposite were the case. And sometimes that's enough to see that if the answers we get for the next 12 are absurd, then that tells us that Providence must be functioning. So it will deepen our conviction in that conclusion. But again, we want to go beyond just merely logical thinking or just taking the opposites. We want to have a real feel for it. And so again, I'm going to add a few words to it. What if it doesn't exist or it's not functioning? What if Providence is not imminent? It doesn't unfold into our realms. Maybe it exists, but it stays transcendent above our world and never touches us. So it's possible that it exists, but it's not functioning. So we still have to consider that, and that may be helpful in creating our own answers and thinking about and contemplating them. So when we're looking at someone else's, like we're looking at Proclus's work here, we want to be contemplating what follows from his words, or what are the implications of what he came up with. And do we like his answers? Do we agree with them? And when we're making our own, again, we're contemplating what would the world be like if there was no Providence functioning? That's what we're considering here. Okay, so we're going to take the same 12 questions, but now we're going to consider if Providence is not functioning or does not exist. Then what follows for Providence in relation to itself? Well, here's Proclus's answers. He says that there would be incompleteness and a non-productivity, ineffectiveness existing for itself alone if it was not functioning. Not true would be an overflowing abundance or a superfluidity, that's really hard to say, sufficiency or self-extension. And partly true, partly not true, not being busy and not being bothered. For in a way, this will be true of that which does not exercise Providence, and in a way not, since things secondary to it will not be controlled by it. What follows for Providence in relation to others and to those things that would participate in it if it were actually functioning? Well, it is plainly true that it is unmixed. It has no communication with anything, and it knows nothing. What would not be true would be that it would assimilate everything to itself, or that it dispenses to all things their appropriate good. And partly true, partly not true, an object of striving for them. For this is in a way possible, and in a way not possible. For if it is through transcendent superiority that it is said to exercise Providence as being superior to all relationship and activity, there is nothing preventing it from being an object of striving to all things secondary to it. But if it is said not to do so through being deprived of this power, then it would not even be an object of striving. What follows for others in relation to themselves? How would we interact with one another if Providence does not exist, or if Providence is not functioning in our world? Well, being unordered or random in our activity, indefinite in our receptivity, receiving many uncoordinated impulses into our own natures, being subject to random and unorganized movement. Not true, convergence upon one goal, apportionment according to value, arrangement according to rational disposition. Okay, so some of it is the opposite of what we saw before, but he is adding to it as well. Partly true, partly not true, being good, for by virtue of existing, all things must be good. To even exist, because goodness in itself is what holds things together and allows them to exist. So if you exist, there must be some good there. And yet if Providence does not exist, then one would be unable to say whence they derive their good. Finally, what follows for others in relation to Providence? What are the implications for us in relation to Providence if Providence is not functioning in our world? Well, what would be true would be being unaffected by Providence or being uncoordinated with it. Not true, being measured and defined by it. Partly true, partly not true, being ignorant of it. For all things which have come to birth must know this much about it, that it does not exist, if it does not exist. And yet, not knowing it, for they will have nothing in common with it. And so there you have Proclus's example there of 24 questions and his sample answers for Providence. This is a dialectic that is worth studying and contemplating in itself, and it also can be a model for you to use to try your own dialectic on other absolute realities. So I hope you found that helpful. If you did, I would appreciate a thumbs up. And also, if you don't already subscribe, I hope you will think about it. I do try to put out a new video each week or two. So far, I've been able to do every week, and hopefully I'll be able to continue. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below, and there's also an email address. And also, if there are any requests that you have for future videos, please let me know what they are, and I will try to do them as quickly as I can. So, thank you very much. See you next time.